let me read off a list of excellent credentials that Ibram has. I should say Dr. Ibram Kendi. So my mistake for underbossing you. But best-selling author, New York Times best-selling author, founder of the Antiracist Research and Policy Center at American University. He won the National Book Award in 2016. Youngest person to do so, correct? Yes. You cannot, look, be tired of being humble, okay? So, all right, just go ahead and claim that. For his book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. He also has a new book, which is coming out in August, aptly named after this panel, called How to Be an Anti-Racist, which you can pre-order right now. So be sure to do that on Amazon, Apple. I looked all this up. You know, I got to plug this book. How to Be an Anti-Racist by Dr. Kendi. So let's give him a warm welcome. So Ibram, let's start there. Explain the concept of being an anti-racist.
So I think first and foremost, we've been led to believe that the sort of contrast is between racist and not racist. I'm sure you've heard someone say, "I'm not racist." Anybody heard that? And so when someone says to me, "I'm not racist," I typically respond, well, what is a not racist? Like, what does it mean to be not racist as opposed to racist? And typically people have never actually thought about that question. And it's also the case that typically people cannot even define racist. And typically the concept of not racism is really an act of denial. And so if the contrast from racist is not racist, does that make sense? It is anti-racist. And so really, when we sort of understand the contrast, and I'm speaking really about the contrast because it's hard to understand what it means to be anti-racist without understanding what it means to be racist. But anti-racist ideas suggest that the racial groups are equals. Racist ideas suggest that certain racial groups are superior or inferior, better or worse than others. Racist policies yield racial inequity. Anti-racist policies yield racial equity. Racist people are people who are expressing racist ideas or are supporting racist policies with their action or even inaction. And I say inaction because if you do nothing in the face of racist policies, then essentially, since racist policies are more or less the norm, you're maintaining that norm of racism. While to be anti-racist is one who is expressing anti-racist ideas or supporting anti-racist policies with their action.
Can you give an example of an anti-racist policy or policies?
Sure. We've been talking about one over the last few weeks, reparations. When you ask me about reparations, I say, how do you eliminate or even begin to eliminate the wealth gap in this country without reparations? And how do you eliminate a wealth gap that's actually growing according to projections? Or even something like healthcare for all, or even Obamacare, which significantly increased the number of Latinx and African Americans who had health insurance. These are policies that reduced racial inequities.
Most of us, and you've talked about this before in previous talks you've given, we have sort of been taught that, the root of racism is ignorance and hate. But you have a much different definition or way of looking at racism. So what is the root cause of racism in your mind?
Sure. So in writing Stamped from the Beginning, which was a history of racist ideas, I essentially wanted to answer that question because I think we've been taught this sort of causal relationship, that the sort of core, that the cradle is ignorance and hate. In other words, ignorant and hateful people are the people who have produced racist ideas. They produce racist ideas because of their ignorance and hate. And then we've been taught that people who have these racist ideas are the people who've instituted racist policies, from slaveholding to Jim Crowing to mass deporting and incarcerating. And we think it's because of their racist ideas that they are instituting and defending and supporting these policies. Does that sound familiar to anyone? And so I wanted to basically, in writing this history of racist ideas, I wanted to figure out, okay, is that true? Are the people who have produced, and I say produced as opposed to consumed for a very specific reason, right? The people who've produced these racist ideas, did they produce them because of their ignorance and hate? And in researching this history and in contextualizing the emergence of different racist ideas over the course of American history, I found that the producers were actually a who's who of American minds. That these are some of the most brilliant, in terms of the way they've been categorized, Americans in history. And even some of these people, according to them, privately loved black people. Or at least that's what they said, based on their relationships with black people. I don't want to name names, but I think y'all know what I'm talking about. And so what I found actually was that instead of racist ideas leading to racist policies, I actually found racist policies leading to racist ideas. In other words, as many of you know, when you want to institute a racist policy, you typically have to make a case for that racist policy, right? And that case for racist policies is typically something to demean a particular racial group. When people resist your racist policy, you typically have to defend that resistance with racist ideas. Of course, black people are going to be 40% of the incarcerated population in this country, even though they only make up 13% of the national population, because they're so criminal-like. That's a defense of the racist policies that led to the mass incarceration. And so I actually found racist policies leading to racist ideas. And I actually found the sort of core or cradle as good old self-interest. That people have instituted racist policies because it made them money, because it got them elected or kept them elected, because it allowed them to excel in their professions, or it allowed them to maintain their cultural or professional life. And then they produced these ideas to defend those policies, to justify those policies. And then Americans mass consumed those ideas. They started believing that Latinx immigrants were rapists and animals, and then that led them to become ignorant and hateful.
What you were discussing earlier, I often refer to it as the Sal's Pizzaria theory. If any of you have seen Do the Right Thing,
yes.
Spike Lee asked John Turturro, how come you don't like black people? And you call us, and you have all these black people here on your wall. Like, there's a difference between how you individually may feel about a black person. Because I always say the easiest thing in the world is to like a really cool, famous black person. Yeah. That's really easy. It's a whole different thing when you have to embrace us all as a group, right?
Precisely.
And there's no skin in the game. So you mentioned, you just hit on something about self-interest leading to sort of racist policy. But what you've also discovered in your research is that a lot of the racist progress always follows the racial progress, right? And I was reading today about a poll that was done, that was in the Washington Post, where it said, and this is, again, not me picking on a particular party, but this was how the research was defined, that 47% of Republicans think it's okay to refuse service to someone based on their race, religion, or sexual orientation. That number has doubled since 2014, the last time they took this poll. And it's also seeing increasing numbers among Democrats and among independents. Those numbers are 18% and 24% respectively. So I ask you, why is that the case? How do we go from, say, this racial nirvana people were in after electing Barack Obama to what we have now? Why is that progress often followed by even deeper and more defined and starker racism?
So I think that's actually a question I was sort of wrestling with in writing Stamped from the Beginning, because I think our generation, for instance, has dealt with mass incarceration, has dealt with a series of different sort of issues that our parents' generation did not deal with. At the same time, our parents' generation was saying to us, well, you got it better than we do. And we were like, well, and so it's been this constant generational conflict to a certain extent within the Black community, in which younger people are saying it's worse, or it's still bad, or it's worse than ever. And older people are saying, oh no, there's no way it's worse than it was when I was coming up in Jim Crow. And in writing this history of racist ideas, I had to write a history of Black America. And so I actually found that both positions were correct. That it is, in fact, the case that we've had racial progress, but it's simultaneously the case that we've had racist progress. And to your question, how that happens is when anti-racist activists and Americans have essentially been able to break down barriers, barriers of policies that benefited people, and of course excluded other people. Those who benefited from those barriers did not just like fly home to their states or to their golf courses in Palm Beach, not to pick on a particular party either. And you know, they stayed and figured out new and ever more sophisticated ways to exclude people, to suppress people, to oppress people. And I think we've seen that, for instance, with the ways in which voter suppression over the last 40 years have gotten ever more sophisticated, right? Voter ID laws are a much more sophisticated form of voter suppression than poll taxes, right? And so I think that I wanted to sort of show that, and how that fundamentally at its core, we're engaged in this struggle, right? This struggle between these two historical forces, racial progress and racist progress. And at some point, there's going to be essentially a moment in which this nation is going to have to choose. Because essentially we've been trying to sort of have both elements simultaneously driving the sort of history of this country. And eventually it's essentially not going to work.
As many of you guys know that are sitting in the audience, and I'm sure, obviously, as you know as well, whenever we try in this country to have a conversation about race, it goes absolutely nowhere. You know, I would probably have a more productive time just banging my head against a brick wall. So why are these conversations that we try to have about race, why are they so unproductive?
Oh man, where's my...
Yeah, I know. Just get your book out and just start reading it right up
Exactly.
here, yeah.
So I think first and foremost, this isn't in any sort of order. I think you have everyone imagine themselves as the expert on race because they're racialized. And so what happens is we even, for instance, have difficulty talking about medicine. At the same time, we recognize there's a such thing as medical researchers and doctors, right? So can you imagine if, generally speaking, we didn't even consider doctors to have expertise, how difficult it would be for us to sort of have a conversation, a difficult conversation about medicine. And with that being said, part of the difficulty is you have so many people who refuse to accept their diagnosis. And you have so many institutions who refuse to accept that they are racist, and who constantly, of course, want to defend themselves, even though those whose expertise is assessing them is essentially making the case how and why they're racist. And I think people do not want to be identified as racist, partly because of the way that we've actually defined it. And what I mean by that is, I think in many ways, people believe that a racist is like a fixed category. It's like an identity. It's essentially who you are. And combined with that, we've been led to believe that a racist is fundamentally a bad person. And so I'm a good person, so I'm not racist. And I don't want to have that sort of tattoo on myself for the rest of my life. When in fact, at least I define racist and even anti-racist as not a fixed category. It's not necessarily who you are, but what you are doing in the moment. And the reason why that's critical is because there's so many complex people. So when it comes to criminal justice, they're racist. But when it comes to the environment, they're anti-racist. And when it comes to healthcare, they're anti-racist. But then when it comes to education, they're racist. And so people are deeply complex. And so I really think we should define it based on what a person is saying and doing in the moment. I also think that there's a lot of stakes to sort of this conversation, right? And there are people who benefit, obviously, from racism. I believe that people, in certain ways, have actually been misled into believing how much they benefit. And what I mean by that is, so you take, for instance, white middle income and white working class and white poor people. Do they benefit from racism compared to black middle income people and black working people and black poor people? Without question. But do they benefit from racism as much as white upper income people? No, they do not. There are different levels of benefit for racist policies. And typically, white upper income people, particularly those who are behind these policies, are typically trying to convince white middle income people that they benefit from racism more than they would a more egalitarian society. And so now, as a result, you have so many white people dying of whiteness, to use the title of one recent book, without necessarily realizing how and why that's happening. Yes. You also have black elites who are seeking to distance themselves from the black poor, who are reinforcing racist ideas of the black poor, who imagine that that's how they ascend in this society, when in fact, studies have shown that as you rise on the economic ladder as a black person, the more likely you are to experience racism. And those racist policies are justified based on racist ideas about the black poor. And so you have people supporting the very ideas that are actually harming their own economic ascent. So I'm saying this all to say, because I can go on and on about this.
And we will let you.
We have been so misled and manipulated about the way race and racism operates in this country that so many people think it's in their self-interest, when in fact it's really not.
One of the things you've also talked about, I think this is before you wrote about the history of racist ideas, that you had to deal with your own racism. Share that experience and what racist ideals were you struggling and trying to come to terms with?
Sure. So, first of all, I'll say that a lot of how to be an anti-racist is me expressing that. Is me really expressing this sort of journey that I had to partake in. Really, in many ways, being raised in a black middle class that really had just arrived until the middle class in the 1980s, and black middle income people who were simultaneously raised in civil rights and black power, and so who knew the way in which racism functioned, but simultaneously imagined that their arrival into the middle class was based on their own hard work. And that's contrasting themselves with the black poor. And so in many ways, growing up in those spaces, I was led to believe as a black middle income person that I was superior behaviorally to the black poor. I mention this distinction between black elites and the black poor because these are two racialized groups. These are two racial groups, right? And so whenever we take any group and racialize, we say the black poor as opposed to the poor, we're essentially imagining or creating a racial group. I also was not raised in any way, in any sort of aggressive way to think of black women as equal to black men. I was not raised in any aggressive way to think of the black queer community, white queer community, as equal to black heterosexuals. I was not raised I can sort of go on and on. There's so many different groups within the black community, let alone other communities, that are degraded and demeaned, that even us too have been sort of manipulated into believing that is the case. And so in many ways, I had to come to grips with that. I had to sort of look in the mirror And I had to recognize the ways in which I had sort of internalized racist ideas. And that's why I actually sort of argue in How to Be an Anti-Racist that internalized racism is the real black on black crime.
I want to go back to something you said a moment ago about how a lot of times these conversations we have about race are unproductive because everyone fancies themselves as an expert in this area. And I know a particular frustration for me, and I know a lot of people of color, this is a frustration, is that sometimes when we have those conversations, we are simultaneously educating at the same time. And I just feel like if you're gonna have a conversation about race, it's just about 10 basic facts I need you to know before we have this conversation. And so I ask you, the expert, the doctor, can you even have a conversation about race if you lack a knowledge about racist history?
No, you can't.
Why is that important to know that history going into these conversations? You can expand on that as well.
Well, I think in order to, typically when we have conversations about race, we're having conversations about our racialized world, our society, racial disparities today, the reasons for that, what some people would say, what's wrong with this or that particular racial group. And every time we're engaged in those conversations, we're really having a historical sort of conversation without necessarily knowing it. And we're constantly talking about why this is the case, right? I mean, even reparations and the discussion we've been having as a nation for the last few weeks, if anything, the last 150 years, has been a historical discussion, right? And so I think history is absolutely central. But what I also think is absolutely critical, and even more critical than history, is how we define terms. And so typically we're having a conversation with somebody and we have completely different definitions of racist, to give an example, or even race. And how can we have a productive conversation with differing definitions? Clearly, when someone who writes or tells a New York Times reporter what's wrong with the term white supremacy, and then later in that very same story says, I'm not racist, clearly he has a different definition of a racist than I do, right? And many of you do. And I think we have to have a basic definition of racist. So when I encourage people to have conversations with their crazy uncle about how and why he's racist, yeah. I actually encourage people to first have a discussion with him or even her about simply defining the term racist. That you can't even talk about race with that person without having a definition of that term. You can't call that person a racist when they have a completely different definition of what a racist is, or they don't even know what a racist is, they just know that what? They're not it. Which doesn't make any sense, right? How can you know you're not racist and you have no idea, you can't define racist in a very simple way to apply it to yourself? But don't get me started.
No, I mean, it's the same as when you ask them if racism exists and they say yes, but you can give them, they don't want to name any examples of it. They just make it seem like it's an abstract concept that's out there in the universe, bubbling somewhere, but it's not there. It's like, what? It's got to exist somewhere, right? I just want to tell you guys, too, I think we're going to leave about 15 minutes for questions. So if you have any questions, not statements, okay? If you have any questions, you can sort of start thinking of those now. I'm not sure exactly time-wise where we are, but I wanted to kind of plant that seed right now. Another interesting thing that you have discussed and talked about is the difference between segregationist ideas and assimilationist ideas. Can you explain what that difference is?
Sure. So in writing Stamped from the beginning, I thought that ultimately I was going to write this sort of two-way debate over the course of American history between racist ideas and anti-racist ideas, as I just sort of described. Those ideas suggesting that the racial groups are equals and other ideas suggesting racial hierarchy. But the more I researched specifically racist ideas, the more I realized that actually there have been two groups of racist ideas constantly challenging each other, constantly debating each other. And so really Stamped is a three-way debate, two kinds of racist ideas, segregationist and assimilationist ideas, constantly sort of battling anti-racist ideas. So the easiest way to understand the difference between segregationist and assimilationist ideas is the nature versus nurture debate. So segregationist ideas typically state that black people, let's say, are inferior by nature. Basically, we are genetically inferior, biologically inferior, permanently inferior. Assimilationist ideas typically state that black people are inferior by nurture, that we're all created equal, but black people were born and bred in barbaric Africa. Black people were born and bred in those barbaric, broken black homes, or those barbaric, broken black communities, or those pathological cultures. And so because we're all created equal, assimilationists would say, and because their inferiority was nurtured, we can also nurture away their inferiority. We literally can civilize and develop black people. And essentially racial progress from the standpoint of assimilationists is civilizing black people. While segregationists are like, you can't civilize them. It's impossible. You can't. They're by nature stupid. They have a stupid gene. So how do you think you can ever make them intelligent? It is impossible. And assimilationists are like, no, remember what Thomas Jefferson said. We're all created equal. We can do this. Look at that black person who was raised in that white home. Look at how great and civilized they became. And so anyway, this has been a back and forth discussion. And assimilationists were peopling abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement. Many liberals, progressives, even radicals are assimilationists. And I think one of the things I wanted to do with Stamped is show that fundamentally it doesn't matter how and why you explain a particular racial group. In the case of Stamped, black people are inferior. If you say a particular group, and I keep saying group, is inferior, you're expressing a racist idea.
Now, is there, with assimilationist ideas, is that similar to the sort of respectability ideal that we have to, that our humanity is conditional? That we have to, people will treat you better if you pulled your pants up, that kind of thing. Are those very similar?
Yes, and so in Stamped from the beginning, I call it uplift suasion. I call this strategy, this strategy to undermine white racism as uplift suasion. It was largely taught to black people by white abolitionists. And then black people basically started passing it down from generation to generation. And most black people have been taught that if you would only act better, then they will think better. If you only uplift yourselves, then you can essentially persuade away white racist ideas. And what that fundamentally means, this very popular, potentially the most popular strategy within and outside of the black community to undermine racist ideas, what it fundamentally says is that black people are partially responsible for the racist ideas that white people have about them. That you are responsible. Your negative behavior has caused this. So if you would only act better, they would think better about you. And to suggest that somehow black people are responsible, that there's some truth to racist ideas, anti-black racist ideas, is to essentially express a racist idea. So that's the irony. This extremely popular strategy to undermine racist ideas that has circulated pervasively in the black community, let alone in liberal white communities, is based in a racist idea. And then we wonder why it has failed. But what even is more striking is when somehow black individuals are able to act in an upstanding manner. It doesn't oftentimes persuade away racist ideas. What people say is, oh, you're extraordinary. You're not like those ordinary, inferior black people.
Sal's Pizzaria, I'm telling you.
Exactly. You're extraordinary. Oh my God, I've never met somebody like you, right? And so it's just striking how we still, and I think many people are finally beginning to realize the politics of respectability has failed miserably. The politics of respectability forces each individual black person to carry the entire race So you ever see black people walking around with their backs bent, it's because they're carrying the entire race on their back, right? And so hopefully at some point we'll eliminate this and stop using it.
We can open this up for questions now, but I want to ask you one last question. So a lot of people, when we think about race and racism, it feels like this huge unsolvable problem that we can never, ever fully tackle. But you have a more optimistic view of that. What is that view? Is this a problem that we can actually solve?
So I do think it's a problem we can solve. And I don't think that it's a problem we can solve because I can see the future. I think it's a problem that we can solve. I believe that we should believe that it's a problem we can solve, because once we believe that it's impossible, it's guaranteed that we won't be able to solve it, right? And so I also, as a student of history, if this panel, if we would have been talking, we probably wouldn't be talking, but if we would have been talking in 1860, before the election of Abraham Lincoln, before South Carolina succeeded, or even afterwards, we could have been talking about, can chattel slavery ever be ended? Right? Slaveholders were the richest group of men, because they were mostly men, but 40% of them were women, as a new book has showed, the richest group of people in the world. The combined assets of enslaved people in 1860 were worth more than all other American assets combined. When you talk about the power of slaveholders and the wealth of slaveholders, you're talking about a collection of people and a collection of power that this nation has never before seen. And so to imagine that these extremely powerful people who are so powerful and wealthy could lose their assets, that slavery, which had lived in this country for 250 years, and was only continuing to become even more, quote, productive from the standpoint of slaveholders and their wealth, could in 5 years be no more, at least in the case of chattel slavery, right? People would have thought you were crazy. I mean, it's impossible. It's too embedded. It's too historic. There's so many powerful forces against it. And it's the same thing with Haiti, right? For those of you who aren't familiar with the Haitian Revolution, in 1791, these enslaved people decided that they were going to rise up against their slave masters. Haiti was the most profitable colony in the world in 1791, the jewel of the French Empire. The British Empire, the Portuguese, all of the other colonial empires all wanted Haiti because it was so wealthy. And so to imagine that in 13 years, that these enslaved people with no military training could defeat local masters and armies from Spain, England, and England in succession to win their freedom. People would have thought, that's just impossible. I mean, I can go on and on with examples from history, even the American Revolution. If somebody would have thought these 13 small, weak colonies or states, if you wanted to call them, could defeat the mighty British Empire, people would have thought, that's just crazy. Right? But it happened. And it happened because the people believed it could happen. And they were committed to creating a different type of world for themselves.
All right, we're going to open up the floor for questions. So please raise your hand. I see this gentleman here. You with the glasses? Yeah, you turning around. Yeah, there's somebody bring your microphone.
Thank you. That was excellent. And I'm wondering, I just finished reading Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, and I think she did an excellent job of defining racism as a system of oppression as opposed to a personal choice. It's it's there, you benefit from it, or you don't. That's its purpose. You talked about the importance of defining racism, but I unless I missed it, which is possible, I didn't hear your personal definition. Is there one that you would offer us? How do you define racism?
Sure. So racism, I would define it as a collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequity that are substantiated by racist ideas. Sure. A collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequity that are substantiated by racist ideas. And anti-racism is pretty simple, using the same terms. Anti-racism is a collection of anti-racist policies leading to racial, anybody want to take a guess? Equity that are substantiated by anti-racist ideas.
Thank you. Thank you for this. It's the most comprehensive talk I've seen on racism in my whole life. I really appreciate you.
That's because of Jamel.
How do you differentiate race? Erase that I said how. Do you differentiate racism from white supremacy? And if you do, how and why?
So I see racism, the way I understand the relationship between racism and white supremacy is that the effect, the result of racism, those policies, those inequities, those ideas, is white supremacy, right? And so that's what happens, right, when you have a series of racist policies, particularly pro-white racist policies, as most racist policies are. It's going to lead to white supremacy. It's going to lead to a current nation in which people of color are growing in size, but their power, right, particularly at a national level, and even in many states, are not growing in size. Another way I understand white supremacy is the way in which white supremacy normalizes whiteness. And that's when you really are supreme, right? Even when you think of power, right? When you think of power, absolute power that truly has power, you don't have to flex your muscles, right? You don't have to continuously use violence or other forms to essentially subdue. You literally, like, your power is absolute, it's supreme, it's understood, it's considered to be normal. In the way whiteness, as a result of white supremacy, which comes out of racism, has been normalized.
Hi, I have two quick questions. One is about allyship and really wanting you to speak to what you feel are the greatest missteps you see in the process of anyone's desire to be an ally and what you believe that actually means. And then the second question is about internalized racism for folks of color, and particularly folks in positions of power within institutions. What do you feel are the greatest opportunities for them as gatekeepers to really model anti-racism? So 2 questions.
Sure. So, you mind if I take the second one first? Okay. So, there's been pushback among Black folk in particular about this idea that we can internalize racism too. What I've found is some of the most forceful pushback has been Black people in positions of power. And the reason why they've pushed back is because the way it's currently sort of conceived, when a Black person gets in a position of power and reproduces and maintains the same anti-Black racist policies as their white predecessors, and they defend those policies with the same racist ideas as their white predecessors, we certainly don't call them racist in the way we did their white predecessors. So in anything, because of the color of their skin, they're given a pass, which then allows them, right, to continuously do that, which is why they're actually empowered in those positions in the first place. And they imagine that all they essentially have to do is sit in those positions, because if they do, they're a credit to the race. But if we say, no, it's not enough for you to sit in those positions, that you have the power to either further racist or anti-racist policies, what are you gonna do? It puts them in a completely different situation that they don't wanna be in, right? And so I think that people in positions of power, Black people or people of color more broadly in positions of power, need to, obviously, if they're going to be anti-racist, ensure that they are pushing and defending policies that create more racial equity. And to your first question in terms of allyship, I think that we've had many, and I suspect you're talking about white allies. Okay. And one of the things that I think has happened is when white allies think about their goal has been to what? Be not racist, right? And so what I'm arguing is that no, your goal should be to be anti-racist, because if you're not striving to be anti-racist, then you're striving to be racist, and you're certainly not going to be an ally if you're what? If you're racist. And so I think it's critical for people to essentially strive, and for them to recognize, for allies to recognize that there's no in-between safe space, neutrality in this struggle, right? What are we doing? Either we're furthering and reproducing this unequal society, or we're part of the struggle against it.
Thank you for your several examples of how people overcame the unthinkable. One of the things about those examples is that there were very tangible ends, the end of slavery, the end of colonization. How do you recommend that we deal with things like implicit bias, these unconscious beliefs that are really hard for us to sometimes operationalize and even more so see in our settings? What are recommendations to really use anti-racist approaches to these things?
So I think one of the good things about this sort of emergence of notions of implicit and unconscious bias over the last, I guess it's been 20 years now, has been that it causes people to talk about race and racism, sometimes not even using the R word, right? And so it opens the door for people to have these discussions. I think one of the downsides of concepts of implicit and unconscious bias is that what causes a person to be biased? We don't have that conversation. Ideas. That's what causes them to be biased. So I think that's why I don't really write or speak on bias, whether implicit or not, because to me, I want to talk about what's underlying the bias itself, and that's ideas, right? And I would also argue that if we talk about ideas, we can then see how those ideas are actually very overt, very explicit. But what happens is people don't recognize their own ideas as racist. And so I can ask anybody, why, for instance, is the black unemployment rate twice as high in this country as the white unemployment rate? There's only two ways they can answer that question. Either they can say there's something wrong with black workers or something right about white workers, which is an explicit expression of racist ideas, or they could say what? Racist policies. And so I think it's how we're asking the question can actually get people to see what's actually in their minds and what's underlying this bias that has become implicit because we're not asking the right questions.
Thank you. So I liked the concept that you talked about around assimilation. And what I'm curious about is, what do you think it looks like to be, because we interact with so many systems and institutions, what do you think it looks like to be successful and black without feeding into the concept of assimilation?
So I think more or less, first and foremost, to be yourself, to be who you want to be in the world. And if you create a standard that you want to measure yourself by as a black person, then that standard should not be unattainable. What I mean by that is, if you, as a dark-skinned or even a brown-skinned person, have this standard that white skin is beautiful, you've now created a standard that's completely unattainable, right? And so instead of creating a standard that is actually attainable, which is closer to your skin complexion, right? I would also say that black people, like other group of people, should recognize that what makes us equal to white people and other racial groups is actually not because of the great black people, and there's some great black people in this room that I could point out, it's because of our imperfections. It's our imperfections that actually make us human and thereby equal. So be yourself. Now, the problem is if you're yourself, if you essentially be yourself, which means that at times you're going to, quote, exhibit black stereotypes. At times you're going to have your lazy day. At times you're going to be human. What's going to happen, obviously, is racist people are going to generalize you and that individual behavior and then potentially punish you as a result. And so then the question becomes, fundamentally, for us as we're navigating these institutions, is it better for us to be ourselves? Or is it better for us to essentially continuously try to wear the mask to essentially ascend? And we have to make those decisions for ourselves. I've had a pretty difficult road through the academy because I've refused to kowtow in certain ways that other young black academics do. And it's been an extremely difficult road for me. And I wouldn't suggest it on anyone. But at the same time, I'm happy. And I'm happy with who I am.
We have a young lady in the back. Yep, you.
I'll use my outside voice. Thank you.
We probably have time for one more question after this, and then we have to wrap up.
Thank you. Just quickly on being ourselves, I want to say that in California, there is pending legislation called the Crown Act, which will make discrimination against hairstyles illegal, which I think it sounds like...
Are they going to do that at the airports too?
You ain't lying, boy.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
Let's hope so. You'll have to come to LAX and test it out.
Yeah. All the way in 2019, huh?
Yeah.
You're just not getting around to that.
Earlier today, I got a chance to hear Tara Westover talk from her novel, Educated, about how she learned about slavery. She learned about it in rural Idaho from a book on her father's mantle that was talking about slave owners having such a hard time. Woe, woe, woe is the slave holders. Earlier this week, I saw something on the internet talking about how slaveholders actually got reparations before slavery was outlawed, something I didn't know, and I consider myself a fairly well-read person. So my question to you today is, what place does the truth play in creating an anti-racist society?
So I think the truth is central. Racist ideas have long been built on lies. Racist ideas need believers, not thinkers. Thinkers typically look for the truth. Believers are liable to believe anything, right? And so I think the truth is absolutely central. And you're absolutely correct about slaveholders, receiving reparations. And actually, I guess was probably supposed to be pub in the Atlantic. I actually wrote a piece in the Atlantic.
It's allowed. I'll allow it.
Earlier this week, which was framed around a speech Abraham Lincoln gave on December 1st, 1862, with the Emancipation Proclamation pending in 4 weeks, trying to, from his standpoint, unify the country because so many Northerners were against the Emancipation Proclamation. And so in his attempt to bring these people together and to create this compromise among friends, to quote him directly, he essentially offered, in his address to Congress, a 13th Amendment. And that 13th Amendment would first and foremost make it such that each state would need to emancipate their enslaved black people by January 1st, 1900. That's not a misprint. By January 1st, 1900. And those slaveholders would be compensated for emancipating all of those enslaved people. And, which I didn't talk about in the piece, black people who would like to leave America and go back to Africa, they would pay their way. That was his proposal. And essentially, that was compensating, right, slaveholders who had long, as you sort of mentioned, been projecting themselves as the victims. This is a war of northern aggression, that we are victimized, as South Carolina secessionists wrote when they seceded from Union, by abolitionists, that we are the true victims. And as a result, Lincoln was like, okay, you're a victim, let's compensate you, let's repair you, let's give you reparations by compensating you for these enslaved people. You know, we know, I'm sure for those of you who haven't heard about that, that was the second time he did that, because he also made that case in his first address to Congress in 1861. But we haven't heard about that, right? Because it was pretty much rejected and the Emancipation Proclamation came forth. But that's how close this country was to black people being enslaved another 37 years. And all of those rich white people receiving wealth for emancipating their slaves. I mean, can you imagine how close we were to that?
Mind blown. Final question right here. How you get paid to be racist? That's amazing. Anyway, go ahead.
I echo everyone here to thank you both. The question I have has to do with healing. I'm from the city of Pittsburgh, where June of this month, we marked the year of the untimely death of Antoine Rose, 17-year-old young black man, exemplary, shot in the back, unarmed, by a police officer. It was striking and deeply painful amidst the case and the verdict of the police officer. And so my question to you, and this story, as we all know, it's not an uncommon story across our nation. So my question to you is, as black people and as people of color are pursuing and fighting for the upholding of anti-racist ideals towards racial equity, are there tenets from which one could also draw a sense of healing and a capability of dealing with pain, while at the same time you're resisting from which pain is often generated in the first place?
So I think that what more and more people in the movement are calling self-care, I would argue that that is absolutely essential. And I didn't really write about this in How to Be an Anti-Racist, but I sort of spoke to it indirectly, that it's absolutely essential to being anti-racist. And the reason being is because if you are truly going to be a part of this struggle, you have to be a part of this struggle for some time, right? You know, you can't essentially organize yourself into the grave, right? You literally have to figure out a way to ensure that you're putting your health first, right? And I sort of had to learn this in particular because for a time I didn't put my health first, and it led to me being diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer, which I had to deal with last year. And that sort of showed me just how important, right, it was for each of us to ensure that we, as we're sort of doing this type of work, and as we're literally consuming and engaged and really relating to the trauma, because if you're truly, you know, somebody who's working on Antoine's case, like you are almost feeling the pain of his family, right? And so constantly sort of feeling this pain, the pain of racism. You know, we have people right now who are feeling the pain of those children in those camps at the border, right? And so at the same time, if you're feeling this pain constantly, like, what are you doing to take care of yourself? What are you doing to release yourself to ensure that that pain is not going to essentially kill you? And I think that's absolutely critical, because if we don't do it, then we're going to have another untimely death. And there's been so many untimely deaths of people, as we know, who have been engaged in this type of work.
Well, I want to thank you guys for attending and being an active and captive audience. Please, a round of applause for Dr. Kendi.